Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Just on the cusp of the afternoon now, I can see people streaming in numbers. Welcome to the COVID-19 and plastic packaging system webinar from the Sustainable Business Network. Thank you so much for joining us. We're expecting about 200 people online today with us for about an hour. We're going to kick off shortly and run till 1:15. We've got 4 great speakers for you who I'll introduce shortly, and they're going to run about 10 minutes each, after which we're going to do a full Q&A. So make sure you pump your questions into the Q&A box as people are speaking, and I will bring those to the participants at the end. This is brought to you in partnership with Foodstuffs and New Zealand King Salmon. Thank you so much to both of them. Obviously, we couldn't do any of this without that sort of support, and you can support us too if you go to sustainable.org.nz and see what SBN has been up to recently and what you might like to get behind. This is part of our bigger piece of work on the circular economy and on plastic packaging specifically, which we've been working on now for a couple of years, trying to develop a system that's circular for New Zealand, that works with minimal waste and gets a lot of those issues out of the way and creates those huge opportunities globally for us to innovate and solve these problems for other countries too. Obviously, it comes on the back of the announcement yesterday with the mandatory product stewardship introduced by the government, which we've known for some time, but it's looking like it's the real deal. And plastic packaging is one of those areas that will be a major focus. So very, very timely moment to be speaking about these issues. Our plastic packaging masterclasses have been running throughout this program, and the next one of those will be on Friday the 16th of October in Auckland. I'll mention that again at the end, but essentially that's a chance for you to get together live with members from all over different sectors to talk about the plastic packaging situation and really grapple with it. What's been wonderful about those events is they've really been workshops in the real sense. They're not just tea and biscuits. People get in, roll their sleeves up and are doing real work and producing some really useful stuff for many industries. And we've got guidance on our websites that have been created by that you can use in your own business to guide your decision making as we go forward. Obviously things went kind of strange in lockdown in a myriad of ways, and that includes in the plastic packaging system, which has brought us to this event to sort of have a chat about that, see what's changed, what stayed the same, and also what new opportunities might have arisen and how we can grapple with them. And to talk through that, we've got Mike Salmons from Foodstuffs New Zealand, Gemma McCowan from New Zealand King Salmon, Michael Basagre from Sealed Air, and Dominic Dixon from Reclaim. Not Peter Thorne as advertised. They've switched in need at the last moment, but that's absolutely fine. Dominic is well briefed to take you on. Just to say, Gemma McGowan will not be available for the Q&A, so if you've got questions for New Zealand King Salmon specifically, pump those into the Q&A when you get the chance, and we'll definitely take those to her and come back to your responses as much as we possibly can. And obviously, they'll be going forward into the masterclass too, and there'll be more chances to talk through issues in that particular sector and where they're going and the sort of exciting work that they're doing. First up, I'll just welcome my colleague Kate Hasselhoff from SBN. She's leading our plastic packaging work and gives you a little bit of more overview of what we're doing and how we're placing this event today. Kate.
Awesome, thanks Andy. Let me just get my presentation going. Awesome, can everyone see that all right? Great. So kia ora everyone, I'm Kate. I lead SBN's Plastic Packaging Circular Innovation Program. The program was designed to help businesses make more informed packaging decisions and also help New Zealand transition to a circular economy for packaging. The program kind of started in 2018 where we diagnosed the New Zealand plastic packaging system. And during that time, we kind of discovered the New Plastics Economy Global Commitment. This commitment aims to make 100% of plastics reusable, recyclable or compostable by 2025 in practice and at scale. The kind of core elements of this program or how they're going to achieve it is by focusing on these 3 principles of eliminating the plastics we don't need, innovating to ensure the plastics that we do need are reusable, recyclable or compostable, and circulating our plastics or their replacements so that we keep them in use in the economy and out of our environment. There's a link there if you haven't seen it. SBN signed on to this and so has the New Zealand government via the Ministry for the Environment. So I recommend that you take a look. So I don't know, some of you may have already seen this, but in some of the communications that went out from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation last week, there was a really great video. And so I thought we'd just show that today as a good context setter. So I'll move to that now.
In 2016, our report showed that if we continue with business as usual, there will be more plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050. This new Breaking the Plastic Wave study shows that even if we do everything we physically can, every technology deployed that we understand today, we can only reduce the flow of plastic packaging into the ocean by 80% by 2040. That's the next 20 years. But we need to do more. Millions of dollars are being spent on cleaning up beaches, rivers, streets, recycling, but it's not enough, because all that will be in vain if we continue to pour plastic packaging which has no value into the economy. We need to tackle this flood at source. We need to go to the beginning of the system, so every piece of plastic that is manufactured has a value. We need to eliminate all the plastic we don't need. We need to innovate for the plastic we do, making sure it is reusable, recyclable, and compostable. And importantly, we need to circulate everything we produce, be that plastic or a biological component which replaces it. That's what sits behind the global commitment. This is the vision of the new Plastics Economy Global Commitment, and this is the vision that over 450 organizations, including some of the biggest companies in the world, countries, regions have signed up to. We've already seen significant action, and these include reducing the amount of virgin plastics which enter the global economy, radical innovation in the way businesses operate and provide solutions to their customers, and billions of dollars that have been committed to increase the use of recycled plastic around the world, keeping it in the economy and out of the ocean. But we need to raise our level of ambition and match it with bold and urgent action to accelerate the transition to a circular economy for plastics.
Awesome. So yeah, as I said before, if you haven't seen that before or looked at the New Plastics Economy Global Commitment, we really encourage you to do so and see if you can make your business align to it as well. So back to the Plastic Packaging 2025 Circular Innovation Program that SBN is running. As I said before, we did our 2018 plastic packaging system diagnosis, where we talked to some key stakeholders from across the packaging industries and plastic systems, and kind of realized that everyone's doing a really, really great job, and there's a lot of work being done in this place, but what was really needed is a bit more of a coordinated action. And so that kind of manifested itself in our 2019 Masterclass series. So last year we held 3 sessions on Eliminate, Innovate and Circulate. And as Andy kind of said before, we brought together some of the key stakeholders that were representative of the New Zealand plastic packaging system all together in a room to share knowledge, share best practice in packaging, and also co-create some really good guides and resources. As a part of that Masterclass series, we also created a pathway to 2025, which has some key steps that we think that New Zealand needs to make to meet those 2025 commitments. After those series, we kind of gathered all of the information from the day and all of the tools and resources that we co-created and put them into an outputs report and this more high-level plastic packaging guidance. So if your organisation is looking for some help in their decision-making around plastic packaging, I recommend you take a look at that. We'll be sending out a link to download the resource to anyone that registered through Eventbrite after this session today. And yeah, I'll come back to you shortly with what we've got going on in the program for the rest of the year. But for now, I'll pass you back to Andy and he can introduce our first speaker. Thanks, Andy.
Awesome. Thank you, Kate. Fantastic. Yeah, do get involved in that. It's one of the most kind of exciting pieces of work we're doing out there at the moment. And it's really sort of having a lot of effect on the ground. And it's really exciting to see people kind of talking to each other and grappling with the issues that spread across the different companies, as you'll hear from other speakers today. And I'll go flick straight on to Mike Salmons from Foodstuffs New Zealand. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about the current and predicted impacts of COVID-19 on plastic packaging, how that's changing the world that's out there and how we respond to that. Mike.
Great. Can you hear me, Andy?
Yep, indeed.
Great. Okay. Kia ora and good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Great. Okay, Andy, can you see that okay?
Yep, good as gold.
Great. Okay. So kia ora, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Salmons, Head of Sustainability at Foodstuffs New Zealand. I'm going to give you a 10-minute explanation of what we're doing around packaging and how COVID-19 affected us and its likely impacts going forward. So on to the first slide. So this is a bit of context for you in terms of our road to 2025. It's fundamentally based on implementing our principles, and I'll show you a little bit of a time frame in the next slide. But we developed 10 packaging principles back in a couple of years ago now, and started implementing those in the different areas of our business. So in terms of those transition areas, we've got 5 main areas. We've got in-store packaging, the retail and the wholesale. We've got our private label packaging, and you'll be familiar with brands such as Pam's and Value and Pam's Finest. And then we've got the actual retail packaging that we sell to customers, so items such as Glad Wrap and such like. And then the vast majority of the product, which is supplier branded packaging. And then we've also got the tertiary packaging in our logistics and supply chain. So in terms of what we're doing, the next slide will explain that in terms of the actual projects. We've pledged to move all our private label and all our in-store packaging, and that's the packaging we actually buy in and then put product into, and that's going to be 100% recyclable, compostable, reusable 2025. And the first thing you probably noticed was that we got out of the single-use plastic bags at checkout. And then we've done lots of innovation since then, and I'll touch upon those in the next slide. But you'll be familiar with things such as us moving out of oxo-degradables and plastic straws. And then going forward, we look to expand the amount of stores who are actually doing food in the nude in. So that's or naked packaging or naked product. So that's where we have the minimum amount of packaging and hopefully no packaging within the produce that we're actually selling. Right, on to the next slide. So that is the milestones that we've actually hit and we will continue to deliver. So we started the packaging principles back in April 2019. And then we've got, I'll pick a few highlights out in that we've been doing trials of home compostable bags. We've been working with EcoStore in putting refilleries actually into store where people can bring in EcoStore packaging that's empty and then they can refill it in store. Obviously paper bags at checkout, and then we've done other work such as phasing out the oxo-degradables so we don't have any of them in store. We've been looking to transition more of our product lines into rPET. So prior to this timeline, we'd already transitioned our meat trays out of polystyrene into rPET, and then this year we started doing introducing the rPET bottles right across our business, following on from the trials from last year. So lots of other work going on. We've already trialed putting fibre trays into our deli and our bakery departments, and hopefully we'll push on with that later this year and into next year. And then a really important part of this whole transition has been working with SBN and doing the masterclass workshops and helping our suppliers actually understand where we're going on this. So the whole program has been led by Kelly McLean, who's our Sustainable Packaging Project Manager at Foodstuffs New Zealand. So thanks to Kelly on all of that. So what happened during COVID? Well, as you doubtlessly found, it was a completely different experience in store. We were looking to reduce all non-essential human interaction, so we stopped what we call serve over in places such as in deli and butchery, and we moved to a pre-packaged model, which inevitably led to far higher levels of increased plastic packaging in store, as evidenced by that photo. So what was the customer reaction in terms of more plastic packaging? Well, we went out to our customer base in May, and we've gone out to them every week since. And it's still fairly representational, the feedback we're getting as it was in May. The vast majority of people said, yeah, it was actually a good thing. They did have health and safety concerns, and they preferred during lockdown period that we actually moved to a pre-packaged solution. But they actually liked the fact that after lockdown, we moved out of it. Though we still had, a quarter of customers said they would prefer it as an ongoing basis, but we're starting to see that trend down now. The farther out of lockdown we get, and the longer period we actually stay in level 1. And that was true right across the brands. And as I say, that's been the general flavour of it. So moving on to the next slide. So what does come next? Well, as long as we hopefully remain at level 1 in New Zealand, it's business as usual for us in terms of implementing our packaging strategy. So that's going to be the focus on reusables, recyclables and compostables. There's a big focus as well on rationalisation within our business of plastic packaging, down to, especially around the rigid areas, down to plastics 1 and 2, to align with the council collections. And we see that as the most sustainable commercial model going forward for plastics recycling, and hopefully we'll get much bigger growth in the actual domestic recycling business as a result of them getting fewer types of plastic and higher quality plastics. So the third point there, so there's going to be a number of drivers that are going to come through government policy changes. Yesterday we heard that plastic packaging was one of the 6 products to be deemed a priority product. So we do expect more product stewardship schemes. We've already been involved with some early feedback on some design ideas around container deposit schemes in New Zealand. And container deposit, in terms of policy acceptance, has now got bipartisan support. So it's in National's environmental policy programme as well as Labour's. So it's going to come basically, and that's okay. Whatever the government wants to deliver, we're more than happy to work with them on that and help implement it and help make it a success at our stores. So we do expect more announcements in regards to problematic packaging materials. And so we're already got an active program of phasing out both PVC and polystyrene in our stores. And we would encourage all our suppliers to focus on those 2 particular materials and look for alternatives. In terms of the waste levy, well, we've seen an announcement a couple of weeks ago that the waste levy will go up from $10 a tonne in terms of landfill tax to $60 a tonne by 2025. And that's really going to help as well in terms of not just diversion from landfill, but also investment into the council's recycling schemes and to investment in New Zealand infrastructure. So the government already earmarked 124 million now to accelerate domestic recycling within New Zealand, which is great news. And going on to point 4, well, in terms of the challenges for retail, well, soft plastics, is always the elephant in the room when we're talking about packaging. It's extremely functional. It does have some benefits in terms of preserving shelf life and avoiding food waste, but at the end of its life, it is incredibly problematic to actually deal with. In New Zealand, we've got limited domestic recycling capacity for soft plastics, and there's obviously no overseas market anymore. And with the Basel Convention kicking in at the end of this year, you wouldn't be able to export it anyway, even if there was an overseas market. So point 5, this is a really important one as well. We're seeing an increased acceptance of reusable systems around the world now. There's a company, if you don't know them, Google them and have a look at them. They're called Loop. They are starting trials with the likes of Tesco now in the UK. They're already in Carrefour in New Zealand and Kroger and Walgreens in the US. And their plans are for expansion throughout the world to Canada, Japan and Australia from next year. So, so there is an increased acceptance due to people accepting behaviour change in that area. And that's a good thing. And we'll keep a close eye on that to see if there's opportunities within New Zealand. In terms of what the other retailers are doing, well, Aldi's just committed to a 50% volume reduction of plastic packaging by 2025. You would expect that the other large supermarket chains around the world would do the same. And that's the end of the slides. So thanks for taking the time to listen to that, and I'll hand back to Andy.
Thank you very much, Mike. That's fantastic, and it's so good to see kind of the front end, the kind of where the rubber hits the road in retail, doing the heavy lifting there, and there's some good little leadership positions in there, and I'm sure more work to come. Just to say, in case you've joined us late, I can see that we've got a few coming in later. This is COVID-19 and plastic packaging webinar from the Sustainable Business Network. And do, as you go, feel free to pump questions into the Q&A for Mike and others. We've got some coming through. We'll do a quick Q&A panel at the end. You're with us till 1:15, and we'll go straight on to Gemma McCowan from New Zealand King Salmon. She's going to talk to us about market impacts of COVID-19, the transition to e-commerce and its packaging implications. Thanks, Gemma.
Good afternoon all, kia ora. I'm Gemma McCowan. I look after brands and sustainability over here at New Zealand King Salmon. And just let me organise to share my screen. There we go, should be coming. How's that look, Andy? All good?
Yep, perfect.
All right. So just as some quick context setting, these are the brands: Ora King, Regal, Southern Ocean, Omega Plus, and some salmon burley, big catch in our portfolio. In particular, we were challenged with Ora King as a restaurant brand around the world, and I'll tell you some more about that shortly. These are the strategies in our business, and you can see that King Salmon is our core focus, and we're a big exporter, and we aim to take on the premium salmon niches around the world. Sustainability is a big part of what we do and of our stories for all our brands, and we came across some challenges during COVID in pursuing both those strategies, which I'll talk about. Just some quick context. It's a very small pond that we farm king salmon in terms of the world. We're the largest producer of king salmon in the world, and there are only 5 king salmon farmers in the world. So we do something quite unique. Now, 54% of our sales are export. As a result of COVID, we had some challenges there. From a sustainability perspective, the main goal from King Salmon's point of view that we're talking today is being really committed to using resources responsibly. And as a result, we are a signatory in the New Zealand Plastics Declaration, and we have a very active program in terms of reducing, recycling, eliminating our plastic packaging, not only on the retail packaging side of things, but also the consumables within our factory. And again, that point became very important during COVID. I noticed that Mike mentioned polystyrene. We're certainly pursuing polystyrene elimination in our business, and last year launched quite a cartonisation program across domestic in New Zealand to eliminate quite a significant amount of polystyrene in our business. So now to lockdown. I thought I'd better just talk around our business in lockdown and what happened come March 25. So our China sales were already suspended, and the percentages in the brackets there just demonstrate the proportion of sales per market. So we all know the borders closed, there were no passenger flights. So for exporters like us with a highly perishable product, we found there was no cargo space to send product overseas. New Zealand food service closed, the restaurants closed in 3 days, that's 25% of our business. The US was closed or limited access, Australia, Europe, Southeast Asia, it's like dominoes, and that all occurred in a very short period of time. We were very lucky to continue as an essential service producing food mainly for New Zealand supermarkets, and that's around 20% of our business. But as Mike also said, most servovers were closed, and we have a significant business in moving fresh salmon through supermarket servovers in New Zealand. And of course, when lockdown occurred, we all know that consumers weren't really shopping fresh produce. They were certainly in the toilet paper aisle, and packaged food was very popular. So we were hit by that when we were very dependent on New Zealand retail for keeping our business sustainable. On the right-hand side, I think this is a really relevant image to show. This is the poster we used internally to really up the ante on the hygiene practices we already had in place in the factory, in our factories. And you can see the amount of PPE that we used during COVID, and this is an instruction poster for our team members. And we already have a significant program running in terms of reducing consumables and PPE single use in our factories. And with the increased need from COVID, we certainly need to persevere on that point quite significantly. But we're really proud of the measures we put in place as an essential business, and that our team members were safe and went home safe, and we didn't have any incident within the business. So this is a quick look at the international markets, and as I described, we ended up in a position where there were question marks everywhere, and there remain question marks as to how those markets will go, because here in New Zealand, we're the lucky country, really. It is a bit of the new normal in New Zealand, but raging beyond our borders is still that COVID challenge. And as exporters, we have people in market, and we're really facing that reality on a day-to-day basis as our markets fluctuate just so significantly at the moment. So I never thought I'd write this title on a slide, but I've used it more than once. What do brands do in a global pandemic? You know, did we ever think about this before 2020? And our focus was on retaining the customers we did have to keep our 550 team members employed, recruiting more, and restoring those customers who are gradually coming back, particularly in food service, and reinventing ourselves. And our strategy has always been diversification, and we are pursuing diversification even more so now. So whether that be geography, channel, category, product, we really value that diversification in our business to keep ourselves sustainable, particularly in these times. So Mike already touched on some of these trends. We know them, and there is implications through these trends in terms of plastic packaging, online shopping, cooking at home, attention to food safety and hygiene. I mean, we have a very perishable, delicate product in king salmon, whether it comes fresh for sashimi or smoked, whether hot smoked or cold smoked, and it's really high fat, luxurious fish, but it also crumbles or breaks really easily if out of the cold chain or mistreated in transport. So packaging plays a really important part in playing a robust solution, providing a robust solution for food safety, for transport, for shelf life, just protecting the product so it arrives in a great state. So we have a dilemma in that we're aiming to reduce or eliminate our plastic packaging, but we can't afford to compromise on the other points. And that continues to be our challenge and a real balancing act. So in terms of the response over COVID, we were pursuing market access because it was very hard to get our product out. And we can see a real opportunity for putting more product out frozen by sea. And certainly there's a change in consumer attitudes and trade attitudes towards the frozen product created at high quality for a premium audience. And I think that's a good thing in terms of gradually shifting the balance from air freight to frozen. But it is a challenge for New Zealand exporters who operate at the premium end of the food chain, supplying, you know, these top products around the world. Often they are perishable and do need air freight to get there on time, otherwise you lose your shelf life. So it's another balancing act we need to consider. New Zealand retail was so important to us over this time that we worked really hard to convey the health benefits of salmon. We had a challenge in our essential business obligations to provide safe merchandising in store, and again there's a protective equipment implication there in terms of the amount of plastic and single-use plastic we used for our merchandisers to keep them safe in store. And alternatives to serve over, of course, are pre-pack, and you find more plastic packaging in that space. We did find new channels in food box customers and e-commerce channels in New Zealand and overseas, and there are certainly implications to sending smaller bundles of product out longer distance and the packaging that comes with that. In food service, you take away delivery options. You've all seen the plastic containers you can potentially get, and although we're seeing a shift towards more sustainable options, sometimes with hot food or food that's easy to spill, there are certain containers that are needed for that. So just a few slides now to give you some examples of these points, and naturally what you get here is B2C. You get smaller pack sizes that you're sending out via e-commerce. People are demanding greater hygiene and greater convenience. There's a packaging implication there. The cold chain, we had increased needs over COVID, and then the food safety needs, not only for packaging, but also for PPE. So that's really a summary there of what we faced in the packaging context in COVID. This is an example of some retail advertising we whipped up very quickly just to emphasise how king salmon could play a part in a healthy diet for those in tough times during COVID, and also emphasising the local production. This shift online we've seen, and we're seeing overseas, particularly in North America, and we were lucky enough to have some e-commerce channels set up, and particularly in North America already. And you can see here that our Ora King salmon normally goes to chefs and restaurants in the main, and we had to shift that. So our wholesalers overseas and in New Zealand were portioning products and sending them out in smaller bundles. What implication does that have on the amount of packaging we're using up there? And here in New Zealand, we were also emphasising the availability via e-commerce of our king salmon. Amazon.com was an early days prototype that we were working on with the Regal shop on Amazon in the USA. And we were selling a very small amount of packs per week and just experimenting a little bit, learning along the way. And all of a sudden, COVID came along. We couldn't sell any of this in other channels, and people were looking for it online. So I think that's been a boon for us in terms of advancing our e-commerce pursuits. But when you look at the sort of packaging that's required for Regal, when you send out 3 packs of Beechwood smoked salmon, you suddenly have to reassess what's going on with the packaging side of things. And if you're sending something from a warehouse on one side of the US to the other, to a consumer on the other side of the US, and it needs to start frozen and then thaw in transit, which is the way they do it, how can you ensure the cold chain remains in control and that soft, delicate salmon arrives in pristine condition for the consumer? So that bulk of packaging is a challenge on the sustainability side, but then delivers on quality for the consumer and their expectations. So I thought I'd touch on the restaurant side of things and our Ora King brand briefly. We spent a lot of time during lockdown feeding food services. Many hospitality workers around the world were out of work, and so we donated to numerous occasions where our chefs and our partners were feeding hospitality workers. And you can see on the left-hand side the cardboard example there, and on the right-hand side the amount of plastic packaging that must have been used in that scenario on the right there. But we're really proud to be able to give back a bit when food service was hurting around the world. Ora King at Home was quite successful in finding ways and channels to get Ora King at home, but again, how was that transported, and definitely a number of plastic packaging solutions that were added to the mix there. And what's on our mind from a business context is, will restaurants survive? And that's dependent on the market and how COVID is going. And we've seen a good lift up back in New Zealand in terms of restaurants surviving, but will they be the same again? And you can see an increase in the casual dining format, but you can also see this out of home eating is appealing to some, but some people are cocooning and wanting to still eat in home and more high-end delivery. And what does that bring in terms of our plastic usage? And this one really summarises up the alternative ways that food service is innovating. And I got a 3-course meal delivered to my home in Christchurch during lockdown, and there were a lot of plastic containers, but I was very proud of the result of pretending I was in a restaurant at home. So finally, I just wanted to summarise the actions involved for us. It's really about continuing the mission we're on to support the global commitment to reducing, eliminating and recycling from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. But also we're going to need to integrate some of these new channels into our activities. So we do an audit and a review once a year. We set up our priorities for the year, and there's some good progress being made on our part, but we need to integrate that e-commerce packaging, because more and more we see that occurring both in New Zealand and overseas. And as COVID rages in other markets in a prolonged fashion compared to New Zealand, we will see more a continued need for e-commerce and takeout in those markets to continue business. We're investigating things like alternative gel pads and cold chain aids, wool insulation among them. We're continuing to roll out our cartonisation strategies and also reduction of intermediate packaging, which we're finding quite a lot in various SKUs that we work with. And we're also aiming to provide clearer information to our consumers regarding recycling and packaging, and aligning with the APCO guidelines using the ARL logo shortly on our Regal packaging. And we have quite an active project on consumables, and we can't forget PPE and factory consumables. And whilst keeping our factory to the highest standard of hygiene and food safety, we are including those items in our targets. So that's all from me. Appreciate the time and hope that was of interest. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gemma. Yeah, lots of interest there. There's a lot of models there for all of New Zealand, really looking to continue to push out fresh produce into the global market as it shifts, and finding new ways to do that, which is obviously a really big part of our kind of agricultural-based economy as we go on, especially grappling with the soft plastics and those long supply chains. It's good stuff to see, and there'll be probably more thinking done as we get together for the masterclasses. Now, Gemma's got to run away, so she's not available for the Q&A later, but if you do have questions, pump them into the Q&A here, and we'll attempt to address them that way. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Gemma, for your time. And I'll switch straight over, because we're running a little bit behind, and I'll just switch straight over to Michael Basagre from Sealed Air, who's going to talk about the changes witnessed in packaging demand as a result of COVID-19, the current situation, and where we predict it might go next. Michael, thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Right, let me just get the screen up and running. I've gone all the way back. All right, well, welcome and good afternoon. Appreciate being able to contribute and add some context to what's happening through Sealed Air. And just before I kick off, I thought I'd just give a quick introduction to who Sealed Air are and where we've come from. So I like to tell the story that Sealed Air, basically we invented bubble wrap. A couple of guys almost 60 years ago now tried their hand in interior design, trying to create textured wallpaper. Failed miserably, thankfully, and the birth of bubble wrap was made as a result of that failure. So that's a little bit of a background for you. So if you ever get into a bar quiz, hopefully that question pops up and you'll be able to answer that for you guys. So I'm going to talk specifically about e-commerce and packaging and how that impacted and what we saw and what we observed. So during the pandemic. So the best way, I guess, to kick off that is to understand what was happening sort of pre-COVID. And here were sort of three things that we were continuing to talk about and see. So brands and consumers were predominantly focusing on sort of material outcomes. And that's no surprise given that the Colmer Brunton report at the top of the main concerns for Kiwis were plastics in the environment. And so that naturally flowed on to brands and consumers wanting to take action in that space. But with that challenge and that focus, there was a concern, or at least a challenge to try and communicate the right message. You know, what's the right material? Is it the right process that we do? So there was that little bit of a challenge. And then finally, we're seeing pre-COVID, this real challenge between a tug of war between costs and sustainable values. So naturally with any good new innovation or sustainable change, there was going to be some form of investment, whether that was upfront or capital, and then trying to align that with different stakeholders into the sustainable values. So that was what we were seeing sort of pre-COVID. Now hit the pandemic and our lockdown here in New Zealand. Gemma touched on it and Mike touched on it. There was this massive demand in e-commerce as a result of the government only allowing essential businesses to operate physically. So everyone else had to find new ways of sending their orders out the door. So this massive demand in e-commerce was created as a result of the lockdown. A byproduct of that, that shift into main e-commerce or online ordering meant that brands were starting to struggle to find materials as those borders locked down. And so brands were just trying to find any type of material to get orders out the door. That resulted in a number of challenges, whether that was the wrong type of packaging or not enough packaging, or packaging getting lost and damaged. So that sort of created a bit of a challenge in itself. The other trend, or at least the observation that we were seeing during lockdown, was this real challenge between process and delivery expectations. Again, Gemma mentioned a little bit of this in her presentation. So trying to process orders, as I mentioned, trying to get the right packaging out the door, and then trying to get that delivered through the supply chain, which was already backed up. So brands and organizations were challenged with that expectation to get the order out there in a timely manner. So that was the lockdown, that's what we were observing. And then sort of out of lockdown, as we sort of came out of it, this is what we started having more conversations around. So brands were starting to relook at the entire supply chain, not just the material change, which is really good. So I think it forced people, as sort of Gemma mentioned, sort of trying to balance out the pros and cons. And then that resulted in sort of trying to drive new expectations and processes, as I mentioned. So do we focus on the supply chain? Do we focus on the packing areas? So just trying to deliver a different perspective as opposed to just the material. And then finally, what we're starting to see more of is people defining sustainability through a systematical approach that really aligns with their brand values. And I've been fortunate enough to partake in some of the masterclasses that Kate was talking about earlier, and listen to a lot of speakers at the End of Plastics Conference in July last year. And the CEO, Rachel Brown of SBN, and many of the speakers talked about if we're going to make this change on sustainability, we need to look at it from a systematic approach or a systems approach as opposed to individual. So the good thing is we are starting to hear those conversations. We're starting to see brands look at that approach, which is really good. So I'm going to just share with you guys just a couple of examples of where we're sort of seeing this happen. So HealthPost, and we've been sort of part of. So HealthPost is a company sending out health and beauty and pharmaceutical products out near Nelson. And again, when they made their shift to sustainable packaging, in this particular case, a paper padded mailer, they made the shift based on looking at the pros and cons. So not just looking at just the material, but what were the pros and cons outside of that in the supply chain. They're looking at function, which Gemma talked about quite a bit when it comes to perishables. In this particular case, function is still applicable for a retailer. So making sure that it still was sent out and got there in one piece. And then again, aligning that communication with their sustainable values. More recently, New Zealand Post have made some changes to their mailer bag. And again, they've communicated this, and they were fairly aware of the demand from the market and the community around making alternatives. But they've done a really good process of understanding all those materials, similar to HealthPost, understanding the pros and cons, and really trying to make sure that the changes that they make or the alternatives that they add to their range really hit those values that they're talking about. So they've now introduced a paper padded mailer into their range, and really exciting, as of this month, have introduced an 80% New Zealand local recycled content mailer, which is really touching on taking plastic waste out of the waste stream. So really good projects there. Mighty Ape, for those that know, is a pure e-commerce player, and their I guess post-COVID response to sustainability came again from that supply chain perspective, that operational perspective. So they sent out communications via Facebook, and said that, you know, to help align their sustainability goals and values and brand alignment, they focused on the supply chain, saying, hey, we're going to enforce a minimum order value, and then communicating why through sustainability, just as you can sort of see in the middle of that paragraph, that really encourages more sustainable habits. So instead of having to buy one game here and a game there, trying to consolidate that order. And in order for them to do that, they had to ensure that they've got the processes, and that image that you see on the on your screen on the left-hand side is a machine that helps cut down and reduce a carton, so no unnecessary waste, but then it also speeds up that process. So it's really, again, looking at that entire supply chain. So those are some examples. Some resources and tools that we're starting to see pop up, and I would highly recommend those that are listening to look into these. So more recently, the Commerce Commission sent out a guideline talking about environmental claims, which I think is fantastic. It goes into the education process for both the brand as well as the consumer, to make sure that there's no misleading claims. And I'm going to give SBN a little bit of a plug here, because I said I do find their value in the masterclasses and the workshops. So they do a lot of stuff to try and bring the systems together, the infrastructure, the brands, the manufacturers, to try and work out in a practical sense, how does the circular economy work? How do we reduce plastics? So I'd highly encourage going onto their website and tapping into that resources and joining that. And then finally, Wasteman's, you know, do a really good job of, again, creating this awareness around some materials, in this particular case that I'll take a snapshot of, which is compostables, just making people aware of, if you're going to make that change, again, looking at that holistic, systematical approach and the challenges that may come if you make that shift. So all these tools are fantastic, and these are only free, but there are many out there that can be utilized. So yeah, they're really, really good. So that ends my my presentation, and I'll hand you back over to Andy, who will, I think, introduce Dominic from Reclaim. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much, Michael. You can come again. He's selling seats to the workshop there very well indeed. But it's true, it's a solid piece of work. But you can see there as well that it's placed within the partnerships like Wastemins and stuff that were doing a lot of the heavy lifting as well. But it's really good to see the big pieces starting to come together, because with these systems, you know, you have to think about the whole of the chain all at the same time. That's the big challenge that's in front of us. Fantastic. I'll pass on now to Dominic Dixon from Reclaim, who obviously works at the other end of the scale to the likes of Foodstuffs. He's going to update us on New Zealand's recycling system and some of those facilities out there, how they're operating, and what the changes might be coming down the pipe. Dominic.
Kia ora everyone. Thanks very much for the introduction, Michael and Andy. It's amazing to hear all the positive things that are going on in the pipeline from the other speakers. Firstly, I'd just like to say I am not Peter Thorne, although I have been told that I look strikingly similar to him. He apologises for not being able to make it. So I'll just give you a bit of an update on what councils were doing throughout Alert Level 4/lockdown with regard to the recycling of different materials, and then I'll briefly discuss the outlook from a recycling market perspective. Beware, word of warning, I'm not the encyclopedia that Pete is, but I will do my best to answer all your questions. To text, I will just share my screen. Sorry guys. Sweet, I hope that works. Yell out if not. Awesome. So to start off with, before I give an overview, I would just like to thank Janine Brisden and the team at Wastemins, and acknowledge that all of the statistics in the first portion of this presentation are from this organisation. I'd also like to thank them again for their high activity levels during lockdown, providing weekly updates to the waste and recycling industry that I could report back to my managers, etc. on. So that was really fantastic and really, really helpful. So first, we'll go through, so this is just an outline of collated plastics, glass, and a number of other materials around what respondent councils did over lockdown with regard to recycling, processing, what happened to them. So to start off with, we'll go recyclable hard plastics. These guys were, depending on where you live, it could be 1s to 7s, it could be 1s or 2s, or 1s, 2s and 5s. So this is a bit of an overview. 67% of the councils that responded were sending hard plastics to landfill, obviously in line with the World Health Organization guidelines. 21% were processed or recycled. 8% were asked to stockpile, whether that be individually on a domestic residential basis or whether that was at recycling centres. And 4% were not collected at all, so asked to stockpile at a residential level. Soft plastics, these are generally not accepted in curbside collections anyway, even in the good times. So in reality, there was not much of a change when considering the above statistics, but 53% of councils or responded councils were sending soft plastics to landfill. 35% were not accepted in curbside collections, left down to either the soft plastics recycling schemes in your countdowns and other supermarket chains and retailers. And then 6% were obviously stockpiled and 6% were not collected at all. Moving on, fibre. So separated fibre, separated at source. So councils, 60% of respondent councils were sending their separated fibre straight to landfill. 20% were reprocessing or recycling them, and 20%, the remaining 20% were not applicable. Commingled fibre, this was pretty eye-opening for me at least. 82% of respondent councils were sending their commingled fibre to the landfill. 8% were sending these to be reprocessed or recycled. 5% were asking to be stockpiled, and then the remaining 5% were also asking residential stockpiling to take place. Separated glass. Again, this was one of the things that jumped out to me, along with all the articles around confusion among different councils' recycling services. Following World Health Organization guidelines, obviously these councils, or those councils who required residents to separate at source, were found to be more resilient in the face of change, meaning that a lot of their services could actually continue through lockdown. Through COVID, those councils who did continue a separated glass collection were actually allowed to continue to process all their glass without human contact. So that is why you're seeing such a high proportion of glass that was actually recycled and reprocessed. Conversely, commingled glass, a big chunk of that was going to landfill. Approximately 56% of respondent councils were sending their commingled glass straight to landfill. 25% were sending it to be reprocessed or recycled in some fashion. 6% were not collected, and 13% answered not applicable. Organic material, your compost, etc. This one was very variable based on which councils were actually collecting organic material for compost. 44% were sending it directly to landfill. 31% were still processing it or composting it. 6% had suspended services, and there'll be a bit of crossover, I think, between that 19% and the 44%, purely because some were answered non-applicable while others just answered it was going to landfill just like normal. Great, so, sorry. One thing that did pop out to me as well, I mentioned earlier the articles. So those councils who publicised that recycling was ending up in landfill have seen pretty grave contamination plague their recycling ever since lockdown ended. Wellington Recycling in particular has taken a massive hit over the past few months. The announcement that only 1s, 2s and 5s were being collected in the Wellington region could serve as a reminder to people that procuring recyclable material in the first place should be at the top of their list. On the other hand, it could go the other way, with confusion mounting already as to the state of recycling in New Zealand. Now, I don't mean to point fingers, but Christchurch was another level above Wellington. In similar fashion, they publicised their dumping of recycling to landfill, and even implied that if households had extra waste, they could fill up both bins to avoid stockpiling. To put some numbers to this, it's estimated that between the end of lockdown and mid-July, approximately 3,200 tonnes of recycling was sent to landfill. That's about 630 truckloads. And that was primarily due to unruly levels of contamination. As you would expect with everyone sitting at home, general increases in household waste were seen. And there were also increases in, I know that Gemma touched on it, there were also increases in personal protective equipment, which other than there was minimal processes, infrastructure or advice as to how to deal with this. So big problems initially that were quite covered pretty well in the media, unfortunately. However, coming off the back of lockdown, if there was ever a silver lining, it seemed as though public awareness of the sheer volume of waste that we produced was highlighted. Building on this, apologies. Here we go. So building on this, it seems as though Plastic Free July couldn't have come at a better time. While everything else in New Zealand, everything else in 2020 was put on the back burner, we, New Zealand, Aotearoa, are in a pretty unique position to emphasise and promote Plastic Free July. If waste wasn't already in the back of people's minds after lockdown, Plastic Free July should be cementing the idea that waste, in particular plastic waste, is a pivotal problem that needs to be considered in the way that we do Build Back Better. And what better news than this to end Plastic Free July? I'm sure everyone would have shared the same glee that I did in seeing this yesterday. Another step in the right direction, but obviously still a lot of work to go. This also comes with a lot of consideration for container return schemes in New Zealand, something that Mike touched on as well. Finally, I'll just touch on the implications that lockdown had on the economy of recycled plastics. COVID and lockdown had some pretty poor short-term consequences at the other end of recycling. Because of the drastic decrease in the usage of petrochemicals worldwide, with everyone being cooped up at home, not commuting, etc., the price of oil and consequentially the price of virgin petrochemical-based plastic resins dropped significantly. As a result, the price to use virgin plastic resin and companies, the price to use virgin plastic resin was significantly lower than that of recycled plastic resin. And as a result, companies started to lean towards using virgin resins, particularly in those times of unsteadiness that we saw in lockdown. Long term, however, it is a bit more difficult to predict. The waste levy announcement and the injection of funding point towards an improved future, but the proof really will be in the pudding. So stay tuned. Just to finish, I will just talk a little bit about the product stewardship schemes, that wonderful bit of news we had yesterday. So current recycling relies on the commodity values to contribute to or at least fund recycling. In practice, this means the incentive to recycle cuts off when recycling becomes more expensive than landfill. Along with the waste levy increase, this news was very, very well received in our office. The introduction of product stewardship schemes will enable recycling to be viable regardless of whether the material has a high value or an extremely low value. This is because the consumer will be contributing to the full life cycle of the product, which includes the end of life recovery and recycling. And that's it from me. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Awesome. Yeah, there's a certain amount of chaos occurred, and kind of underlines the need for a resilient and a flexible system as we transition into a circular economy to make sure that we can do this work. And also the pressure seems to be on to do more of it in New Zealand itself. You know, one of the things that COVID did, for better or worse, was remind us that we are a remote island a long way from everywhere else. And it seems to me some of the waste systems that we have are designed for places that aren't like that are actually bigger countries. And there may be certain substances or certain processes that we've got used to that we simply can't do, that simply aren't actually that appropriate for this place. Brilliant. So thank you all. What we're going to do now is go into the quick Q&A. We've got about 15 minutes. I've got plenty of questions to ask. So if we can just bring up the video screens of those that spoke, and we might nudge in Kate as well at the bottom in case she wants to chip in. And probably the first port of call would be that announcement yesterday, because that's where most of the questions are coming from, and it's very timely. I just thought I'd read, because I had a little look myself about, you know, what it really means in terms of the mandatory product stewardship on plastic packaging, which is really all they've said, just plastic packaging on its own. So that's not completely defined yet, but what it says is, as soon as it's practical, after a product is declared a priority product, a product stewardship scheme for that product must be developed and accreditation obtained. And it even suggests that they can ban certain substances over time if they don't fit in. So one of the things I wanted to sort of say, bring out to the panel, maybe start with you, Dominic, is, you know, how do you see that panning out in the detail, and what's the work ahead for those that are involved in those sectors?
I mean, it's pretty cool news to start with, but it is pretty challenging for large companies who already have pretty sound life cycle assessments and also supply chains. But the one thing that points out, obviously the timeline may vary considerably, but for me at least, there are some pretty good examples out there already that were the voluntary product stewardship schemes. So I think the fact that there's already some awesome examples for some companies to follow is great, but just making it mandatory and regulating it will be another challenge in itself. Yeah.
Mike, what's Foodstuff's take on it? How are you going to face up to that? It seems a pretty massive challenge.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing a lot of internal reviews in our business to assess how exposed we are, you know, in terms of different material types. I think there's a couple of easy wins, as I mentioned earlier on. I think that it's easy to actually identify single polymers and look to get rid of them, you know, PVC and PS. It's going to be more problematic where you have products, as we have a huge amounts of packaging that are multi-material. So that's going to be a bigger challenge for the government to try and address them. In terms of you know, the other associated government initiatives, and there's going to be more money available, which is a great thing, you know, going into infrastructure, and it dearly needs that, because, you know, in some instances, retailers, you know, I can think of examples where we've actually moved from an unsustainable product to a sustainable product. And it simply isn't being recycled because the councils haven't got the infrastructure in place to recycle even, you know, PET in some cases, because they haven't got optical sorters. So it's needed a huge investment, you know, over the last decade into that, and finally it will get an injection, and we'll be able to sort out some of those issues domestically, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael, Sealed Air, is that something that your company is going to have to grapple with at scale? Because obviously there's a lot of soft plastics in the mix there for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, without having probably a little bit more detail to your earlier point, Andy, it's still fairly ambiguous point, but I think I touched on it in my presentation where it probably applies. You know, we need to look at it systematically, and then work with those particular brands and organizations to try and figure out, you know, how does that impact those particular industries, because I think Gemma mentioned there's that functionality, but especially in that food and health and safety perspective. So, you know, we've got to be careful that we're not, cancelling out something that may potentially have a really good high performing function, like keeping food safe. So I think there'll be a lot more in that space, and we'll obviously do our best to be involved and try and understand what that looks like for us and how we can help our industry and our markets.
Sure. One other question came through, Mike, from Foodstuffs is, as you kind of continue to push the envelope on behavioural change, particularly with your sort of the naked foods, the less packaging at the checkouts kind of thing, on from the plastic bags, how's that sort of stats coming in? How are people responding? Do you think the consumers are happy?
Yeah, but the vast majority of consumers see that as a positive move. There's always a small percentage who don't like change at all. But yeah, it's a win-win really, so from a supplier perspective, they've got a cost saving that they don't have to, put packaging on something, or the foodstuffs in store don't have to put on it. So that's got to be positive. We do have to invest in systems changes within store to enable us to do that. For example, the purpose of soft plastics within the produce department is it stops them dehydrating, and it keeps the product good for longer. So when we remove it, we've got that issue to solve. So we do have to invest in putting what we refer to as misting systems that keep the products hydrated. But we can do that, and as long as the customers positively want that change, we'll continue to do it within the business.
Mm-hmm. And at the other end of the scale, this is one for everyone. I'll probably start with Dominic. Dominic, the waste levy adjustments, can you see them working? And do you think it's enough, or do you think we're going to have to crank that up a little bit more soon?
I mean, the big thing for me is that it is a starting point, at least. We have been a bit behind the 8 ball. I will go out and say it. You look at the likes of the UK, where the waste levy is in excess of about 100 New Zealand dollars. So, I mean, it's a really good starting point. Whether or not it will last, whether or not we'll need to increase it further, is something that I cannot foresee. But to start with, at least, it is very good. And I think it'll certainly help with the likes of onshore reprocessing capabilities and infrastructure. So positive to start with, yeah.
Sure. And Mike, do you think, from Foodstuffs, do you think it's something you can absorb happily at this stage without any sort of cost ratchets for you?
Yeah, so from our perspective, we've had a waste minimisation program in store for since about 2013 now. So we cut waste in our landfill waste in half in the last 5-6 years, and our target is to cut it again. By 2025, we want another further 25% reduction on what is, I think is industry-leading performance. Some of our stores, quite a few of our stores now are over 90% waste diversion. So that's 90% of what you would normally consider waste goes off for, either recycling, or it goes for if it's food waste, it goes for animal stock feed, or it goes for composting, or it goes, if it's fit for human consumption, it goes for food rescue. So bring it on as far as we're concerned. So
good on you.
But it's a great tool. I'm very supportive of the government doing it. As Dominic made the point earlier, if it becomes cheaper to actually recycle or to compost than it does sending it to landfill, that's where you're going to see the change.
Sure thing. And probably the $1 million question is kind of maybe to Michael first, which is slightly unfairly, but soft plastics, what in the long run are we going to do about soft plastics? Is there anything on the horizon, or, other than fence posts and pouring it into asphalt, or what's the deal, do you think?
Yeah, good question. I think that's probably slightly better to answer from the likes of Lynn at soft plastics. But I think from our perspective, it's we're seeing it ramp back up, and the demand for consumers to bring soft plastics to a point to recycle is there. It's just trying to get that wide scale approach to it. I think I shared that example that New Zealand Post are now introducing an 80% recycled content. That's closed loop New Zealand plastics. So that's diverting some cheese bags and some milk bags and regrinding it and then putting it back into a mix to make mailer bags. So that's a start. And so we need to do more of that, sort of diversing the material, to your point, Andy, to not just fence posts, but what else can we do? And again, it's going to take a systematical approach, brands taking some ownerships in and around that, and help with the likes of yourselves to communicate that out. So
Good stuff, Dominic. I was going to ask, the other thing I was going to ask was, I mean, how do you see the sort of whole lockdown experience so far in terms of the kind of, because I know at the workshops, the masterclass particularly, we've been looking at a 2025 kind of timeline to develop these systems. Is it a massive disruption? Was it a wake up call, or have we sort of gone back onto the curve and we're kind of back on track, or is there still bits that are sort of flying out of control out there?
Yeah, I mean, you've seen sort of off the coattails of lockdown, you've seen all these Ministry for Environment, infrastructure and funding allowances come through, which I think it definitely served as a wake-up call. And that's one thing that I'm not sure if I touched on or not, was actually people who were sitting at home, all of a sudden they saw all this waste piling up, and all of a sudden it just popped into their front of the mind. It's all of a sudden it's not just out of sight, out of mind, it's a conscious effort to actually reduce waste. So from my perspective anyway, lockdown, if there was a silver lining, it would be that we were a lot more conscious of our waste. Yeah.
Sure thing. Michael, what was your take on that? I mean, you've detailed a lot of changes in your presentation. Do you think they're locked in, or do you think the dial will swing back in a different way as things settle down?
Well, there was the initial, I guess, response after lockdown, and there was that sort of nervousness of, where do we take some of these sustainable projects? And we thought that they may have been put on hold, but what we're seeing now is that actually they're re-emerging and using the likes of the food safety aspects and the supply chain and the new channels, again, the likes that both Mike and Gemma talked about with e-commerce. So it's bringing new perspectives and then trying to realign how packaging fits within those potentially new channels and those new perspectives. So I think, yeah, it'll have its place. It's just trying to understand where it sits.
Dominic, do you have a sense of how the figures during the lockdown period, especially the level 4 lockdown, compared to the sort of recycling that was going on previously? Was it a shocking change to what was being done? Is it kind of was it a sort of emergency crisis element, or was it just sort of more of the same?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, like I said, those statistics were provided by Wastemans from Janine and the team there, and we didn't really, other than the Coleman Brunton report earlier in the year, there wasn't much information with regard to pre-COVID recycling. There was some studies, but on the whole, it's pretty tough to benchmark where is your benchmark essentially. And that was one of the challenges that I really saw looking at those statistics, was going, is that much higher, is that much lower than normal? But I do have to say that you must acknowledge that the overseas recycling market over the last 4 years is very turbulent, which has provided its challenges, and that was something that really highlighted our onshore processing capabilities, and especially over lockdown with borders closing left, right and centre, was something that was difficult to process.
Yeah, one of the things we found in the early diagnosis was a kind of shocking disarray of actual data, hard data of what's coming in, where it all is, where it's all going. Yeah. Hopefully we're going to see some movement on that too, because obviously you can't manage what you can't measure. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you all for your participation in that. It's been fantastic to have you here with us, and I hope to see you all, you guys who are speakers at the masterclass. We're going to throw back in a minute to Kate just to kind of sum up. Just wanted to mention as well, we've got coming up the product stewardship campaign launch through SBN. And that's on the 13th of August, very timely, of course, with the lovely T-Radar emceeing. Look out for that one. And that's basically, obviously, taking on that challenge that the government set down for us to get into some serious product stewardship. Obviously, that's the non-mandatory side of things, but the big stick it coming is what we're hearing. So if you're in an industry that's looking like it's in the line for that, now is the time to get geared up and find out more. Kate, if you could just sum up for us, and then we'll call it a day.
Perfect. Give me one moment, and I'm just going to share screen again. Awesome. Yeah, so thank you to all of our speakers today. Really great insights into kind of what's gone on in the last couple of months from you. I really appreciate your time, so thanks again. in terms of what we've got coming up at SBN with our Plastic Packaging Circular Innovation Program, on Friday the 16th of October, we're holding our masterclass for 2020. There's just going to be one this year. During these masterclasses, we are aiming to get a good system update from key stakeholders that are representative of New Zealand's plastic packaging system, and try to distill some of the complex system information that's been circulating. During the sessions, we also have a really interactive workshopping part of the day where we can help you to answer some of the questions that you have around packaging, identify challenges that the system is facing, not just individual businesses, but really looking at it at a systems level. It provides access to great experts from government, packaging suppliers, technologists, designers, new materials experts, people in infrastructure and packaged goods suppliers. And during the day, we'll look to co-create some really good packaging guidance, like tools and resources that can be shared more broadly as well. So if you registered via the Eventbrite listing for today's webinar, we'll be sending out a link with where you can get tickets for Masterclass 2020. But if you didn't sign up using that method, then you can get in touch directly with me at kate@sustainable.org.nz. This work would not be possible without our partners. So a huge, huge thanks to Foodstuffs New Zealand and New Zealand King Salmon. This work wouldn't be possible without you. So yeah, thanks bunch. Also to Mark's Design, who help us with some of our resources. Yeah, so that's it from me. Thanks, Andy. Thanks all of our speakers. Had a really, really great time and enjoyed listening to those updates from the last couple of months. Please do get in touch, check out our resources at sustainable.org.nz and email me if you've got any questions about the program. We're always looking for more businesses to engage and more partners in the program, so please do get in touch.
Get in behind. And just the final message to those that have left questions that are quite technical. Obviously, we may not have got to all of them today. We'll get back to you as much as we can, but otherwise do come along to the events where you can grapple with these one-on-one with the experts. Thanks all. Thanks for your time. Hope to see you at the next SBN event.